So I was wondering if you would like to talk about what the most difficult things are to do in these small spaces to make them comfortable. Maybe we can start with Azby. In your work on small spaces in Japan, would you talk a little bit about what you think are the most difficult issues for designers to resolve in order to make the spaces that they're designing feel gracious and comfortable?
Yeah, I guess, Japan is kind of fortunate because it has such a long tradition of, compact design. It has tea houses, has, a great store of ideas and techniques, a kind of a toolkit that it's inherited from, past centuries. And often the best spaces that are very compact but still feel comfortable, they've done something really special with light. Natural light generally, or being able to change the character of the space by changing where light comes from through the day, etc. Also, there's this idea that it's possible to create spaces with different identities within even a small space. Maybe the place where you might sit to work, a place where you might sit to read, where you might sit to eat. Often it simply means changing your orientation, seeing a different small vista. There's a lot of techniques of illusion, layering things that provide a small actual depth, but it seems to trick you, your perception into feeling there's a greater depth. So there's a lot of techniques, and generally they have to do with again these kinds of illusions, kind of dividing space without actually making hard divisions, sort of soft divisions. Maybe through color and material, and maybe through small changes in levels. The other thing I would say is storage is always going to be a big problem, and we see this very well in the model microunit upstairs and in other really well-designed ones. There's a lot of places that can be used to put things. Also, we've had nice discussions with Graham Hill from Life Edited, who's also participated in this project earlier, and this idea that, we just have too much stuff. And if you throw away the stuff you really don't need, or find a way to live without it and concentrate on the things that are most important to you, that both reinforces your character and lends your character to the space and maybe makes your life less cluttered. So.
Yeah, it would be counterproductive, I would say, if all of the micro-unit residents all had additional storage spaces, which I think probably is a Manhattan solution. I have a storage space myself. Pierluigi, do you want to comment on that? You have you've clearly thought about the time of day and what could be combined with what. What's the hardest thing do you find in the work that you do?
The hardest, the approach is the same as the typology, as working with architecture spaces. So of course it would be wonderful to combine the two things, to combine all the goal that project of architecture wants to achieve, if he has the possibility of working on different level. I'm talking about small spaces. And the combination of furniture, because in any case when you design a small space, you have in any case to work a lot on furniture, because the storage space has to be found everywhere, from floor, ceiling, wall. Function also, you have a function that we use, the bed, the working space, the relaxing, and plus the division of the room if there are more than one people living there. So the approach is at the end is the same. Of course, I am concentrated on furniture because this is a solution that can be applied to, as I said before, to an existing room. So how to make a small existing space comfortable. And I hope that the example, the real living proof that we have on the third floor shows that somehow it's possible working with good design, with the chosen of the right materials, because the aim at the end is to make a space not only functional, because to have a different function combined in a room is not always comfortable, because you have to work a little bit, but to make it interesting and to make it combined with nice material, cozy.
Ted, you want to weigh in on this? I've always admired you taught me actually listening to you that volume can be much more important than square footage.
Well, yeah, volume is an important way to try to deal with the issues Pierre was just talking about. And, you know, to put it in a nutshell, though, if there's three things that shared housing really accomplishes, it makes it legal. It makes small units legal. You're not allowed to build little units. You're not allowed, and certainly have a certain number of units you're allowed to build on a property. And you have little ones, you only get a little bit of units, you can't pay for the property, you can't make them affordable. So the laws, in fact, prevent you, but by sharing, you can put 3 or 4 or 5 little suites together in a unit, and the unit's big enough, your number of units is now not too many for the site. The parking requirements don't become cumbersome, which becomes expensive with garages, and it becomes affordable. And I think that's the shared housing advantage in trying to attack these obstacles, which are really just legal obstacles. And then, of course, the other one that we talked about, the volume of space. The main single thing about a little unit is that bed. You know, you want a double bed in the unit, and it uses the whole unit up. And the second most important thing is that accessible bathroom. Mm-hmm. And upstairs, we looked into this idea of a collapsible bathroom. And the idea was that you could basically not collapse the toilet and the shower, but all the space that's required for accessibility inside a little privacy box that's then inside a 300 square foot unit where there isn't anybody to look at you anyway. And so we really like the collapsible bathroom as far as solving those requirements. And of course, if you open the bathroom up, it's really accessible. You're not banging around in a little tiny space trying to navigate it. You just sort of pull a screen open, and now you're in the bedroom bathroom or the living room bathroom. And it's a nice place to towel off. You've got a lot of room. You're not, you know. So volume is real important just spatially. And then the other thing that I would say that's important, especially in New York, from an energy standpoint, is that it's very difficult to make a building that cross ventilates. And certainly if you have a tall space, you can get cross ventilation over top of a corridor that's running along one side of a building. And so the tall space is really important, but then not affordable, because you make a high rise, you got to get a floor every 10 feet, or you'll never get to the enough units to pay for the expensive land. So it's a complicated little puzzle of putting these things together to try to make them affordable. I mean, the whole idea of being small is to make them affordable.
Affordable, and there's also the benefit that we haven't talked about yet, which is the environmental savings that are implicit, or one hopes are implicit in these. Rosanne, do you want to say anything about that?
Well, I think that the density of the living options that these spaces represent is something that's pretty consistent with any number of environmental studies that we actually need to concentrate our living habits in order to reduce our reliance on cars, in order to reduce our personal CO2 footprints. And when you have these shared environments or micro units or small spaces combined, I think we're sort of beginning to express ways to really realize these aspirations that we read about in every environmental study, but really don't typically know how to respond to with respect to how we change our building practices. So we have a nice example in the exhibit upstairs.
A word that came up a number of times in your presentations was shared, which is critically important, I think, and interesting given that, specifically we're talking about micro units, and I think we're mostly thinking about micro units for one person, but in thinking about the social experience for that one person of living in a micro unit and the urban experience of many people living in individual units, all kinds of questions come up, some specific about buildings themselves and what kinds of facilities can be shared, and then I guess bigger questions about urbanism and urbanity. Azby, you mentioned when we were talking before the panel that Japan has is a place where a much larger percentage even than in New York or even Washington, D.C., people live alone. And what are you seeing? Could you talk a little bit both about shared within buildings and the experience in the city?
Right. Yeah, last year, I mean, statistics I saw recently said in 2012, Tokyo finally tipped over 50% of households being single people. This means generally young people, they've moved away from home. A lot of people do return back to their parents' home, like we see in the United States lately, especially in the economic downturn. But it's a lot of people living alone, and the infrastructure of apartments themselves is there. There's a lot of units available. They're very small, 180, 190 square feet, and a lot of people are living this way. What has happened for a lot of people, and it's generally been identified with young single males, is a great isolation. And there's something called otaku. It's like a geek phenomenon where these people basically have no social life. They stay home, they go to work, they come home, they have no social life, they don't really build strong relationships, they don't get girlfriends. The surveys are showing they would rather not have girlfriends, and are online and gaming and living in kind of a fantasy world. And it is associated with a lot of mental illness, a lot of other problems. Japan has traditionally not had these shared features in living environments like we're seeing proposed in this project. And the ones that I showed earlier, I showed because they were examples of new thinking along these lines to try to take care of these problems. Any big city can be very alienating for a lot of people, even if it's a very entertaining and interesting city. In the case of Tokyo, so many people come from outside. It's kind of a truism that nobody is really from Tokyo. They've left their hometowns, their villages, another city across the country, and come without that built-in social support structure. University can build in a kind of community for people, but a work environment generally ends up being very hierarchical, and there's not as much socializing and really becoming friends with your coworkers as there is here. There's a bit of reserve there. So I think a lot of people consider it to be a kind of impending crisis. The government doesn't seem to be approaching it from a design standpoint at all. But certain individuals and groups, and I have to say there is a very progressive trend in Japan, there always has been, some fairly progressive social thinkers see these possibilities and are encouraging these solutions like shared dwellings, etc. And as another example, my university is actually in Kanazawa, although my laboratory is in Tokyo, and Kanazawa is a smaller town across the country with a great historical district, a lot of old houses, and we've seen young people taking over abandoned houses that are 150 years old and turning them into shared homes or shared businesses or other shared facilities, and without having there be any necessary romantic relationship among the people living there. And this is a very radical thing for Japan.
Yeah, I think it's a very important consideration as we here move towards a larger number of people living alone, that shared spaces are equally as important to think about in the initial conception of projects. Rosanne, you and Ted have both had a lot of experience, I think, with buildings that where you have designed in shared spaces. Could you talk a little bit about some of the management considerations and other considerations that are involved in those?
Sure. In the buildings that we've worked on, the design of the common spaces, how accessible and prominent and sort of unavoidable and well designed and programmed and managed they are really pretty essential to making this whole different type of community work, where you're blending people who've had numbers of struggles with homelessness and mental health issues, with people who simply need an affordable place to live. And so in making these blended communities work, thinking about the spaces where people interact and making them really desirable and alive is an important part of the kind of the social glue in the buildings. And the oversight and management, though, we found to be really important, that some of these things do not just happen naturally. Some do, like attractive lobbies where people can sit and watch things go by. That sort of takes care of itself, but you really do have to very explicitly activate certain other spaces that encourage shared activity.
Yeah, and I think it's such a different market we're talking about, where you have a managed population that you're trying to help, versus the particular market that I have experience in, where really the shared feature is a way to make them affordable, and the residents, in fact, do want to share. There's a lot of fun in sharing, but there's also a lot of downsides in sharing. You know, you have fights in the kitchen, and you know who left the junk in there, and you know the whole, or a shared bathroom. My God, this is the worst. So you just what we found out through time is, like, if you say you set up 4 or 5 or 6 little micro units, and you say, well, you got to have a place to hang out, or like a living room space or a kitchen that's better than the little kitchen in the unit. That if you really took that square footage and you put it into each of the little units, or into 2 or 3 of them, then in fact the sharing happens as friendships develop. And what we've discovered over the 30 years of living in and watching is the scenes definitely happen in these buildings, and the scenes are different depending on the occupants, you know, who's outgoing and who isn't, and people get together, and it's sort of a natural thing that happens without any management. You know, come over to my house, I've got the good kitchen, I'll cook kitchen, you've got the crummy little kitchen. Or come over to my house, I've got the really nice roof terrace, you don't. Or come over to my house, it's in the basement, we can play music really loud and not bother anybody. Or mine's big enough to open a ping pong table in. And so you have these kinds of management situation where the domain of the shared space belongs to an individual. And instead of, you know, asking management, who gets the kitchen on Thursday, it's more like the people who are living in the place manage it for you. And
there's not a lot of university dormitories as we know them. They will rent a room in a house where there is a family or a couple who runs the place, and there is some kind of common space, but there's a curfew, there's all kind of rules that you have to, you know, maintain. Of course, you can become friends and do that. I think one thing that I've liked about Ted's approach and what he's discovered is what we talked about as a generosity. In other words, this is a private space, the kitchen or the ping pong table room, and because there's so many wonderful things that happen when you let people do what they want to do, when you let them be themselves. And this is what Rosanne is talking about as well. These things sort of develop naturally if you allow them. And I think what you're talking about is really a very human thing, something very important of human nature, that we can be generous in many ways if we're allowed to. And I think design, in this case, simply by setting literal boundaries, walls, the placement of the space themselves, you create opportunities for that to happen. I think the same thing for Rosanne's projects.
I'll just note that maybe a significant feature here is scale. I think things can happen in a much different, natural, self-organized manner if you're talking about 4 to 6 to 10 people than 200, 300, and that you know, you have to move beyond, you know, relying on self-organization to having some structure when you move to a different scale of operation.
What about, I don't want to dominate it, but what about the idea of shared activity? I mean, in again, back to this Yaraicho project in Tokyo, the ground floor is a shared, you know, workshop studio. You know, people make furniture, and that is kind of like a way for people to come together. What have you found in
Well, we would have shared offices. Again, the office would belong to somebody, and people would share it, but someone's in charge. And the other thing I notice about the management, everybody doesn't arrive on the same day and leave on the same day. There's someone who becomes the old goat there, you know? And the old goat tends to have a lot more power than some new person, and might establish some rules. As we evolved from bringing the kitchens into the private domain, we originally had, well, you had a choice at some point. You can be in, say there's 6 or 12 or 15 units. You could basically share kitchen A or kitchen B, and there was people would sort of self-divide into them. But then there's always sort of this tenure of someone who really knows what's going on. And these are things you would never think about when you're drawing it. But watching it for 30 years, you see, well, oh, that person becomes the boss. and the other person is very happy to be, well, I'm new here. What's the rule, you know?
What's the life cycle of both micro units and buildings with shared spaces? Is there a certain time of life that people will live there, and then 6 years later they predictably move out? Or who lives, Ted, in your spaces, and how long do they stay?
As long as they kill each other.
Until they kill each other, yeah.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And we've had probably, 6 or 7 marriages that have happened in Go Homes. And as soon as there's a couple, we're all right. As soon as there's 2 couples in the house, it falls apart. And one of the couples is going to move out. And we were looking, the project upstairs, and there were a couple gentlemen in wheelchairs that are sitting there looking and say, well, what happens? Can you age in place? I'm going, not in my experience. And again, if you're counting on lofts, you're not going to age in place. If you're counting on some really great furniture, you could do it. So I mean, it's how it's designed, and I think longevity is kind of an important part. But my particular market, they grow up, they get big jobs, they marry, they have children, they move away.
Rosanne?
It differed by the background of the individual, typically. Individuals who had been homeless for long periods of time, had mental health problems, tended to not be looking to move on. But the lower-income working people who were able to quickly recover their feet under them after experiences of homelessness, it seemed to be really other life events that would trigger the moves, not the size of the space, but a work opportunity, a new relationship, reconnection with family, decision to, live in a different city. So.
What do you see, Azby?
Again, it's, I have to approach it as an anthropologist if I'm talking about Japan, but bearing in mind that we started with 100 square feet with families, with kids living in this 100 square feet, that is a very normal thing. Getting to a point in the 1950s where 500 square feet was revolutionarily a large apartment for a family, and was very comfortable. In the early public housing developments had about 500 square feet for a family, maybe up to 700 for a very attractive and fairly expensive one in the 1970s. But the average is still about 450 square feet. And this means families are living in them. And in these small, what are called one-room apartments, one-room mansion, which are conceptually for singles, it's actually often couples or people with small children living in these 190 square feet apartments. So by necessity, they're serving all age groups and many types of family structure. Japan, of course, is facing another crisis of an aging society. Birth rates plummeted. Everyone will be old before too long. And it's a big issue. People are wondering, well, how can we make these compact dwellings comfortable and livable and safe for elderly people with all of their issues of mobility, and all these things that happen with aging? No one in Japan is assuming that bigger dwellings are necessary. I mean, there's a tendency, the aspirational side says, yes, we'd love to have a big house, and still the average Japanese single-family home is about a little more than 1,000 square feet. And that's certainly considered adequate. So by necessity, it's serving everyone, and the assumption is that design and technology will make it possible to solve the problems and make them safer for even people as they age. And yet there's an understanding that there needs to be more flexible types of arrangement. And we touched on the social issues. A big one is, yes, when you have a lot of old people, they need people to be around to have contact with and to check up on them. And that is something that has not been solved yet.
Pierluigi, do you find that your clients are of a particular age group or across the age spectrum?
Very different. can give you an example of the United States. In the United States, for example, there is a big market for Florida, Miami, for example, of old people that decided to move there, and therefore they don't need a big houses. They just want to sell the house wherever they were living in other states in the States, and then buy a smaller place, but on a high quality standard, so in a good city facing the ocean, and they don't need to have big space. So that's one kind of example of how macro unit is used at a certain time of the life of the person. The other typology is of course single and young couple, businessmen. Then they use the space during the week, and then it can become a 2-room sometimes. But I know more the examples of Italy. It's like it's very popular, the 2 rooms apartment. 3 rooms is becoming really unaffordable.
I would say something real quickly. When I was first doing the go homes, there was much writing about the extended family. And we often tried to make the prototype work for an extended family. And we found that the only real way that it worked was that you needed all those adults' incomes. And in fact, the prototype was not at all a market rate response to making the house that you're talking about, which is, you know, a way of life that we all miss, you know. Grandma's home to watch the child, you know, all the different wonderful things that come with an extended family. And I always wanted to be able to say, wow, this is perfect. And I also, after we'd done a few go-homes, I remember my mom and dad were getting older. And I said, Mom and Dad, why don't you get together with some of your friends and sort of have an extended family? That'll be great. And eventually you can get a nurse and, you know, the different things you start worrying about. And of course, my mom and dad wanted nothing to do with it. So I don't really know. And again, I think it's so different with different people. The whole thing that I think we're talking about is this huge range of people and what they're looking for and how different each of them are and what they're after. And I think it's just so important to recognize that and not put one solution thinking it's going to handle a lot of different situations, because it just isn't. There's going to be a lot of different situations. There's going to be wonderful, beautiful furniture that folds out that makes a little space in the middle of Milan wonderful for some people. And there's going to be something completely different, a house in a less expensive neighborhood where an extended family can rent a house and actually afford, you know, to be there together. You know, and that's the old traditional extended shared house where, you know, the zoning department worries about 10 or 12 people there. But in the suburban condition, you know, maybe that's perfect. And in an urban high-rise, it's an entirely different problem. In a Japanese city, there's an entirely different problem, entirely different incomes, entirely different everything. And Rosanne's project's completely different people. And so you have to think of shared housing as this wonderful option to attack 10 different, totally different problems. And never should you put them in one group.